The system had a simple expectation: prison would finish him. Once the door closed, once the distance grew between Harlem and a concrete cell, Bumpy Johnson was supposed to fade into irrelevance. No street access, no money, no leverage. Just time, the kind designed to wear a man down until nothing meaningful remained. That logic had worked before. For most people, prison is subtraction. It strips away options, contacts, identity, especially when the destination isn't just any facility, but places built to isolate, to break continuity, to make sure influence dies quietly behind walls no one can cross. From the outside, it looked final. Harlem without Bumpy. Bumpy without Harlem. End of story. But the system misunderstood what it was removing and what it was leaving behind. Prison can take territory. It can take movement. It can take visibility. What it can't easily take is structure, discipline, the ability to read people and organize silence. Inside confinement, violence becomes inefficient, money becomes useless, and reputation has to be rebuilt from scratch. For most inmates, that's the end. For a few, it's a recalibration. That's where this story begins. Because Bumpy didn't disappear inside prison. He condensed. Cut off from the noise of the streets, he entered an environment where raw power meant nothing and only credibility mattered. Where survival depended not on force, but on balance. Where influence had to be earned daily, without spectacle. What he built behind bars wasn't an empire you could see. It was a framework, a way of thinking, a discipline that would outlast his sentence and reshape Harlem when he returned. The system thought it was isolating a problem. Instead, it gave him time. And when he walked back into Harlem, the neighborhood he left behind was no longer the same because neither was the man who had been expected to die in prison. Prison is designed to remove leverage. It takes away territory, money, and the ability to act directly. What it leaves behind is what can't be confiscated, and that's where the system often miscalculates. For most inmates, incarceration is collapse. For a few, it's clarification. It strips life down to essentials and exposes who actually understands power when nothing else works. That distinction mattered for Bumpy Johnson. Outside, authority could be reinforced by reputation and networks built over years. Inside, none of that counted automatically. Names didn't protect you. History didn't intimidate anyone. Every hierarchy had to be renegotiated under conditions where violence was costly and attention was dangerous. In that environment, prison acts like a filter. It eliminates impulsive actors first. Those who rely on fear burn out quickly. Those who depend on money lose relevance overnight. What remains are people who understand rhythm, restraint, and human behavior under pressure. Prison doesn't reward force. It rewards predictability. This is where many systems fail to anticipate outcomes. They assume removing a leader from the outside world removes their capacity to lead. In reality, it removes noise. It forces leadership to become internal, structural, and disciplined. Influence stops being about issuing orders and becomes about shaping equilibrium: who talks to whom, which conflicts get contained, which tensions are allowed to cool instead of explode. Inside prison, power is rarely visible. It doesn't announce itself. It circulates quietly through favors remembered, disputes settled, and rules respected without being enforced. That kind of authority can't be dismantled by isolation because it doesn't rely on access. It relies on trust, earned under constraints. For Bumpy, incarceration wasn't an interruption of power. It was a test of its purity. What survived confinement wasn't charisma or fear. It was judgment, the ability to keep things from spiraling when everyone else wanted release. That's the part prison can't erase. And it's the part that makes certain people more formidable after confinement than before. Because once power proves it can exist without tools, it no longer depends on them. The system expected decay. What it created instead was refinement. Alcatraz wasn't meant to rehabilitate. It was meant to neutralize. Isolation by geography, routine by design, and control so absolute that even reputation was supposed to drown in it. When inmates were sent there, the message was simple. Whatever you were on the outside ends here. For the system, Alcatraz wasn't a prison, it was a reset button. That's why placing Bumpy Johnson there carried symbolic weight. Distance mattered. Cut Harlem off by water and steel, and influence would evaporate. No visitors who mattered, no communication that could be leveraged, no informal privileges to convert into power. Alcatraz was engineered to turn men into numbers, then let time do the rest. But Alcatraz also revealed a flaw in that logic. When everything is stripped away evenly, the remaining differences become sharper. Inside a place where violence brings punishment and favoritism doesn't exist, authority has to be earned the hard way. Not through fear, not through currency, but through consistency. Who keeps order when tempers flare? Who settles disputes before they draw attention? Who understands the rules well enough to bend without breaking them? In Alcatraz, influence didn't come from commanding others. It came from reducing friction. The men who mattered were the ones who made life predictable in an unpredictable environment. They weren't loud, they weren't visible, they were reliable. That kind of presence spreads quietly, because everyone benefits from stability when the margins for error are razor thin. The system believed Alcatraz would sever continuity. What it actually did was compress it. Bumpy wasn't managing territory anymore. He was studying systems, how authority forms when resources are scarce, how respect is negotiated without threat, how patience outlasts strength. These lessons didn't require communication with Harlem. They required time, observation, and restraint. Alcatraz didn't erase power. It removed distractions. By the time the system assumed he had been reduced to compliance, something else had happened. The man they isolated had adapted to an environment where power couldn't be displayed, only exercised. And that kind of power doesn't weaken when released back into the world. It returns sharper, quieter, and far harder to uproot. What Bumpy Johnson built inside prison wasn't a crew, a racket, or a chain of command. It was something far less visible and far more durable: order. In an environment where every man was stripped to the same uniform and subjected to the same rules, authority couldn't be claimed, it had to be granted. Prison doesn't reward ambition, it punishes it. Anyone who tries to rise too fast draws attention, and attention brings consequences. Bumpy understood that immediately. Instead of competing for dominance, he positioned himself as a stabilizer. When tempers flared, he cooled them. When misunderstandings threatened to escalate, he clarified them, not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, in ways that made problems disappear before guards noticed. That's how real influence forms behind bars. Not through fear, but through reliability. People begin to trust the person who consistently prevents things from getting worse. Over time, that trust compounds. Others defer without being asked. Conflicts route themselves toward the same individual because resolution there is cheaper than chaos. Bumpy didn't need favors to enforce this role. He didn't trade protection or promise outcomes he couldn't control. His value was precision, knowing when to intervene and when to stay silent. That restraint signaled judgment, and judgment is the rarest currency in prison. The system assumed isolation would erase hierarchy. In reality, it forced hierarchy to evolve. Leadership inside wasn't about issuing orders. It was about setting tempo, when to wait, when to speak, when to let rules do their job instead of challenging them. Bumpy mastered that rhythm. And once a rhythm holds, others unconsciously follow it. What's crucial is that none of this required contact with Harlem. No messages needed to be smuggled. No instructions sent out. What he was building wasn't an operation. It was a philosophy of control under constraint, a way of maintaining equilibrium when pressure was constant and options were limited. By the time his sentence neared its end, Bumpy had tested his authority in the most unforgiving environment possible. He had learned which traits survived without money, violence, or freedom. Those lessons would matter far more on the outside than anything he left behind. Prison hadn't weakened him. It had trained him under conditions where mistakes were permanent and patience was everything. The most dangerous assumption the system made was that influence requires communication, that without phone calls, visitors, or messages moving in and out, power simply stops. But what Bumpy Johnson built inside prison didn't depend on instructions traveling back to Harlem. It depended on something far more resilient: precedent. Before his incarceration, Bumpy had already shaped how decisions were made in his absence. He didn't rule by constant command. He ruled by setting boundaries early: what was acceptable, what wasn't, and which conflicts were worth escalating. When he disappeared behind bars, those standards didn't vanish. They filled the vacuum. This is how the pipeline worked without anyone seeing it. Harlem didn't receive orders from prison. It didn't need to. The people left behind weren't waiting for direction. They were applying a framework that had already been internalized. Problems were handled the way Bumpy had always handled them. Disputes were weighed, not rushed. Violence was treated as a cost, not a reflex. That consistency created continuity without contact. Inside prison, Bumpy was refining the same logic under harsher conditions. Outside, Harlem was unconsciously validating it. The two environments never spoke to each other, yet they evolved in parallel. That's the mark of real leadership, when absence doesn't create chaos, but confirmation. The system couldn't see this because it was looking for signals, messages, chains of command. What it missed was culture. Culture doesn't need transmission once it's established. It reproduces itself through behavior. Every choice made in Harlem during Bumpy's absence reinforced the idea that the structure held, even without the man. This made his eventual return inevitable rather than disruptive. There was no power to reclaim because it had never fully left. What waited for him wasn't a territory in need of reconquest, but a community already operating on the principles he had sharpened in confinement. The pipeline wasn't a network of communication. It was a shared understanding of limits, discipline, and restraint. And when a system survives without its leader, it doesn't weaken, it matures. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of prison, he didn't return as a man trying to reclaim what he had lost. That was the mistake many observers made. They expected a struggle, a scramble to reassert authority, to punish rivals, to remind everyone who was in charge. None of that happened, because none of it was necessary. Prison had already done the work. What Bumpy brought back to Harlem wasn't momentum. It was gravity, the kind that pulls situations toward stability without visible effort. He had proven something rare, that his influence didn't depend on freedom. It survived isolation, scarcity, and constant pressure. That proof changed how everyone around him calculated risk. Opponents understood the implication immediately. If prison couldn't erase him, what could? Removing a man who comes back quieter, more disciplined, and less reactive than before doesn't weaken a system, it sharpens it. Any attempt to challenge him now carried higher costs, because it meant confronting someone who had already adapted to worst-case conditions. This is the paradox most institutions fail to anticipate. Prison is designed to punish behavior, not refine leadership. But in rare cases, it becomes a laboratory. It strips away shortcuts and forces power to exist in its purest form. Those who survive that process don't emerge hungry for dominance. They emerge selective. Bumpy no longer needed to assert control through presence. His restraint spoke louder. He intervened less, not more. He listened longer. He allowed others to reveal themselves before responding. That patience unsettled people far more than aggression ever could, because it made outcomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is where power hides. Harlem felt the shift. Conflicts cooled faster. lines were clearer, violence became even more expensive as an option. The neighborhood wasn't ruled by fear of retaliation, but by expectation of consequence. That's a higher level of control, and it's harder to dismantle. The system had assumed prison would neutralize a threat. Instead, it produced someone who understood limits better than anyone else in the room. Someone who had lived without leverage and learned exactly which leverage mattered. By the time anyone realized the miscalculation, it was already too late. The man who was supposed to disappear had returned, transformed, carrying a version of authority that didn't need reinforcement. Prison hadn't made him weaker. It had removed everything that wasn't essential and left behind something far more dangerous. The system believed it understood how power worked. Remove the man, remove the access, remove the influence. Prison, especially places like Alcatraz, was supposed to be an ending, a slow erasure that turned dangerous figures into footnotes. By every institutional measure, Bumpy Johnson was supposed to disappear behind bars. That never happened. What the system failed to grasp was that prison doesn't destroy power by default, it tests it, and in rare cases, it purifies it. By stripping away territory, money, and spectacle, incarceration revealed what actually mattered: judgment, restraint, and the ability to maintain order when nothing else works. Bumpy didn't survive prison by resisting it. He survived by understanding it better than the people who built it. When he returned to Harlem, there was no dramatic takeover, no bloodshed, no need to reassert control. The neighborhood had already adapted. The framework held. The man who came back wasn't louder or more violent. He was quieter, more selective, and far harder to challenge. That was the system's real miscalculation. They thought prison would end a chapter. Instead, it created a foundation. This story isn't about glorifying incarceration or romanticizing survival. It's about recognizing a blind spot in how authority is understood. Power doesn't always depend on freedom. Sometimes it depends on discipline under constraint. And when someone proves they can operate there, every future attempt to neutralize them becomes more complicated. Harlem after prison wasn't the same Harlem as before, and Bumpy Johnson wasn't the same man the system had locked away. What emerged was not a comeback, but a consolidation, the kind that prepares the ground for everything that follows. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the moment the arc truly began.